folks, welcome back. I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading. I have a weekly wrap-up for you with 3 books that I've finished and 3 that I'm hoping to tackle in the upcoming week. So in the finished category I have 1 autobiography and 2 novels. And the coming up in the future I have 1 publishing history and 2 novels. First up I have Down Second Avenue, Growing Up in a South African Ghetto. This is a 1959 memoir or autobiography by Mphahlele, who is a South African writer and teacher who grew up in South Africa but spent a couple of decades of his adult life in exile throughout the African continent and in the United States. So this memoir, Down Second Avenue, was his 2nd book. He published a collection of short stories before it. And it's the only one of his books that I've read, but I've been aware of it for a very long time. It's a classic of South African apartheid literature. In it, he covers his years from when he was about 5, in 1924, to essentially the moment when he goes into exile in 1957. And stylistically, the memoir falls into 2 parts. The first part covers his childhood and adolescence when he's both in rural South Africa living with one of his grandmothers, and then subsequently when he's about 8, 9, 10 moving into the slums outside Pretoria to live with his mother, auntie, and grandmother. And this is a very vivid account of many of the very painful and difficult things required of black people living in South Africa at the time. And it's got very vivid images of both the kind of fooling around that people do in their teenage years, all of the ordinary kind of teenage experiences, and coupled with dealing with the excessive amount of police violence and supervision and surveillance that was a function of apartheid. And the portraits of the women in his lives, his mother, his aunties, his grandmothers, is particularly vivid, and they are the mainstays of the family. They are the ones who are providing the income that keeps the family going and gets their sons primarily through multiple levels of education. Very, very interesting accounts of their lives. The second half of the memoir is less vivid, and I think probably a little less successful as a memoir. He wrote it once he had gone into exile, and it covers his years from the time he was about 16, 17, all the way through a college education and his working life. And it covers a great deal about what it was like to try to get an education as a black man in South Africa and to get a job and keep it. So important stuff to understand about the South African context, but it's not as vividly written. The events recounted in the second half of the memoir are those that led ultimately to his leaving South Africa. He becomes involved in the teachers movement and in unionization efforts, and most importantly in opposition to the very restricted form of education that was about to be imposed upon African schools and African teachers, an education that really limited the scope of what African children could do and understand about the world. So he lost his job as a result of his opposition to this form of education, and ultimately decided to leave South Africa and worked in Nigeria for a while before emigrating further. So would I recommend this book? Yes, especially if you're curious about the impact of apartheid on the lives of intelligent, education-driven people. It's worth a read. And the first half, if you like memoirs of people's childhood, is particularly vivid in its descriptions, so I would recommend this. So the second book I finished last week was The Bottle Factory Outing by Beryl Bainbridge. This one came out in 1974, and if you follow the Bookers or the historical nature of the Bookers, you're probably aware of Beryl Bainbridge. She was nominated 5 times for the Booker, served on the jury at least once, but was never awarded the Booker, which was a shame. So The Bottle Factory was her 5th novel and the 2nd to be nominated for a Booker. It's the story of two women and their workmates. We have Brenda, a rather frumpy, passive, somewhat repressed woman in her early 30s, and her flatmate, who is her opposite in all things, Freda. She's a blousy, overblown, very dramatic young woman of about 22, 23, something like that. And they work pasting labels onto bottles in an Italian-owned and operated bottling plant in London in the early 70s. And since this is a Bainbridge novel, there's a lot of comedy and a lot of bad things that happen. The comedy comes situationally from the difference between Freda and Brenda, the conflicts they have, the world around them. Some of it is pretty broad comedy around Brenda trying to evade one of her bosses who is always trying to grope her, and Freda, who's exactly the opposite, is pursuing another one of the bosses, trying to attract him and keep him sexually. Lots of comedy from that, and there is organized an outing, a Sunday outing, that goes disastrously wrong in all the ways you can expect an outing of a group of Italian men who don't all speak very good English, and two very different young women. Much darkness. And it all somehow coalesces around Windsor Palace. Very odd. It's a very compact novel, about 180 pages, and Bainbridge is very good at compacting stories into a tight time, or tight page count. Other novelists would take maybe 300, 400 pages to tell the story and to build out elaborate character backgrounds and plot points and all of that. Bainbridge collapses all of that into like single sentences. It's a kind of novel, as a result, that rewards close reading. If you read it in one big gulp, which is possible because it's short, and you read it quickly, you're likely to miss things, crucial things to the character development that are conveyed in a sentence or two, just slid into a paragraph, and you can just drift right on by them if you're not paying attention. But it's a marvelous grotesque story, but mostly marvelous in its compression, and how Bainbridge can communicate so much in so few pages and so few words. It's the kind of book, if you like mysteries, you might like this book, because there are lots of mystery story elements in it, lots of clues being dropped along the way, but there's no detective to it. It all comes together, but there's no one leading you through really and saying, pointing you exactly to this clue or that clue or this clue about what has actually happened. But well worth the time you'd spend reading. Really one of Bainbridge's bests, I think, but not a happy story. It's kind of grotesque, kind of slapstick in places. What else? I'm just looking at my notes. What else did I read? Oh yes. I read Blood and Guts by Kathy Acker, which was published in '84, and parts of it were written earlier, around '78. So this one was particularly controversial when it came out in the '80s because of its graphic sexual content, and in part because of the kind of zine-like images of genitalia that are included in it. That tends to get a little bit overblown because it was in its time a little bit shocking. And it's a huge distraction, I think, from what she's trying to do in the novel. It's also one of those novels that it seems impossible to clearly define what the storyline is. There is a central figure named Janie, who purportedly is 10 years old. I don't think she actually is 10 years old, who's living as a prepubescent girl on her own, and who is having elaborate and intensive sex life with her father and his friends and the men around her. And she lives independently and works independently in New York, and ultimately travels to Tangier, I think, to meet her idol, Jean Genet. And the similarity between the two names, Janie and Jean Genet, kind of gives the game away. Acker's goal, in part, I think, is to shock the reader And it is easy to be shocked by this novel. But it's important, I think, to remember that the character Janie really isn't 10 years old. The text tells you she's 10 years old, but she's very clearly modeled on Acker's own experiences. The sections in the novel where Janie is working in a bakery and complaining about it are directly from Acker's life when she was in her 30s and working in a bakery. So that's part of the context that makes this novel a little bit more readable, is if you step back from this shock stuff that Acker puts into it to see that as one of her primary goals is to shock you as a reader. I think it's also helpful when reading it to think about the time period in which it came out in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, that was a period where there was a great deal of public discussion and interest in all the various forms of sexuality, whether it was public sex, cruising, BDSM. There was a burgeoning up of interest and discussion about sexual assault, child sexual assault, intense public discussions, and lots of divisions amongst the discussion. Very little kind of across the board agreement about anything dealing with sexuality. So Acker is writing in that context. I mean, yes, she's trying to shock, deliberately trying to shock, but she's also writing as part of that culture of exploration of the extremes of sexual experiences. Much of Blood and Guts in high school reminds me of zine culture, or say the kind of imagery you'd find in a Robert Crumb comic or an Eileen Kaminsky comic or zine. You know, very in your face about genitals and sexuality and extreme experiences. It's also clear that Acker is a fan of William Burroughs and very interested in literature that's fragmented, which makes the novel difficult to read because it doesn't behave like a novel. She refuses standard storytelling techniques. She's far more interested in fragments and slicing up stories and slicing up bits and pieces of other people's stories and recombining them. All of that makes the novel more difficult to read than it needed to be, really. But it's purposeful. I think that's the thing I came away from the novel with, is that understanding that there's a purposefulness behind this, and an education based on Greek classical poetry and tragedies that's very difficult to get at because of the shock value stuff that she layers, you know, on top, one shocking thing after another. So it's a novel that's very much interested in the extremes and getting you to look at the extremes. But did I enjoy reading this book? Not so much. Would I recommend it? Maybe. Maybe if you're interested in experimental literature, it's very much a Marmite book. If you're comfortable with sexual extremes being discussed and explored, I think it would repay a slow, attentive reading to see what she's doing with all of the bits and pieces and fragments that she's quoting from other people. I didn't have that patience, but I think it probably would reward that. You have to get past the shock jock stuff first. So that's what I finished this year, this week, it feels like a year. Down 2nd Avenue, The Bottling Factory, and Blood and Guts in high school. And the Bottle Factory outing is the best of the bunch that I read. Coming up next week, I've got a nonfiction, a history. I can actually have a physical copy of it. This one, which I've started. You can see from the tabs I've started. This is Penguin Portrait, Alan Lane and the Penguin, editors by Steve Hare. It came out in 1995. So it's essentially a publishing history, but largely drawn from letters and archival material. On the fiction front, I have Elizabeth Bowen, In the Heat of the Day, 1948, about World War II London. I've read very little Bowen. I think I've read one short story, so I thought it was time that I pick up a novel and get a sense of what she's like as a mid-century woman writer. The other book I've got on the docket is this one. This is an Amanda Cross Kate Fantzer novel, The James Joyce Murder. This one came out in 1967. Amanda Cross is a pseudonym for Heilbrun, a literary scholar. Worked at Columbia, I think. I read these in the 1980s. They were all published in the 60s and 70s when it was not done that an academic would publicly acknowledge that they were writing popular literature like a murder mystery. I'm going to dip back into this one kind of as light reading to contrast from some of the heaviness in my reading this week. That's my reading wrap-up for the week. The one I would recommend most would be The Bottle Factory outing. It will repay close, patient reading, and it's gloriously grim and dark and comic at the same time. I hope you have had an excellent reading week and that you have good things waiting for you next week.